For 18 years you've been carrying something you don't have a clean name for. Not the betrayal itself, that part you could name the moment it happened. What you've carried is heavier. It's the weight of knowing that when you finally stopped giving yourself to another person, something in them would begin to give way. You didn't know it as a threat. You never made a threat. You knew it the way you know gravity. And now the news has reached you, not from them, not through them. But it's reached you all the same. It arrived the way this kind of news always arrives for someone like you. Quietly, through a gap in a conversation you weren't supposed to hear, through a third party who had no idea what they were handing you. A single detail, precise, impossible to spin. Something had collapsed, their finances, their reputation, the one thing they were certain they'd protected from any consequence. And it fell, not because the world punishes people, because you walked away. I want to be honest about this, and I want to strip away any framing that makes it feel small. This isn't gossip. What you received is confirmation. When someone like you, someone who has been quietly holding up the architecture of another person's life, finally and completely withdraws, what's left is a deficit that can't be filled from the outside. They don't just feel empty. They are empty, and that emptiness starts showing up in the material world. The news you received is what that looks like, a sudden, irreparable collapse in the one area of their life they never imagined you were quietly sustaining. You were sustaining it. Now you're not. And here is what you don't do. You don't look back to measure the damage. You don't log into an old account. You don't ask a mutual friend how they are doing. This isn't a suggestion. The moment you glance backward, even once, you send something of yourself toward a sinking ship, and that one drop is enough to patch a hole that was meant to stay open. Their unraveling requires your complete, uninterrupted absence to finish what it started. What you've been carrying all this time, the name for it is where I want to go next, the silence of a knowing that had no audience. The long, dim corridor of a loneliness you couldn't explain to the people who loved you because the words you would have needed didn't exist in the language they spoke. They would have told you that you were being dramatic. They would have told you that you were imagining things. They would have said what people always say before the evidence arrives, that your sensitivity is the problem, not the thing your sensitivity kept detecting, but you detected it. You felt the hollowness behind the performance. You sensed the cracks in the structure before anything had visibly cracked. And the cost of that, the real cost, wasn't the years you spent on someone who couldn't receive what you were giving. The real cost was living with a kind of perception that made ordinary life feel like too much. Dinner parties. Family gatherings. Rooms where everyone else seemed to be reading from a script you'd never been handed, laughing at things that weren't funny, agreeing to things that weren't true, and you sitting there, your whole body quietly sounding an alarm that nobody else could hear, trying to convince yourself you were the one who was off. That's the part nobody talks about. Not the betrayal. The years before it, when something in you kept whispering, "This isn't real," and you kept asking it to be quiet. It wouldn't be quiet. It kept coming back, not as anxiety. Anxiety can be managed, reasoned with, pressed down. This was different. This was something that returned no matter how many times you buried it under obligation, under hope, under the plain exhaustion of wanting to just be like everyone else. You'd bury it, and for months, sometimes longer, you'd almost believe it was gone. And then one small thing would surface, a shift in tone, a beat of hesitation, a detail in a story that didn't quite line up, and the knowing would rise up, completely intact, as if it had been waiting there the whole time. What you were carrying for 18 years wasn't doubt. It was a certainty you had to keep hidden. You had relationships, and I don't only mean romantic ones, I mean the full range of the people you tried to build a life alongside that never quite held. Not because they were broken. Not because you were broken. They didn't hold because they were designed for something different than what you were. They were built for companionship, for comfort, for the ordinary back and forth of affection and support. And you were something else. Something structural, quietly load-bearing in ways nobody had the language for. The people in your life weren't wrong for wanting what they wanted. They just didn't know they were holding onto a foundation and calling it a partner, calling it a friend, calling it a child. They felt the steadiness, they just didn't understand where it came from. And then there were the private moments, the ones nobody witnessed, the ones you've never fully put into words for another person, the moments that were more real than any ceremony, more real than any contract or photograph, the ones that happened in the dark, or in a parked car before you turned the engine off, or in a single unexpected breath that carried more than an hour of formal prayer ever did. Pause. You knew something in those moments that you couldn't prove to anyone. You knew you weren't forgotten. You knew the loneliness had a shape, a direction, a reason, but knowing that didn't make it less lonely. 18 years, and then the news reached you. It reached you quietly, through a gap, and what you're being asked to do with that news, not by me, not by a video, but by something that's been governing your path for a long time, is receive it without being pulled backward by it. To let the collapse stand as a closed file. Not a victory. A report. A report that says the account is settled and your presence is no longer needed in that part of your life. You're being asked to notice what's in the space where the weight used to be. It reached you quietly, through a gap, and now you're being asked to do something specific with that news. Not by me, not by a video. By something older than either of us, the same force that's been shaping your path since before you had words for any of it. You're being asked to receive the confirmation without letting it pull you backward. To let what collapsed over there stay collapsed. Not as a victory. As a closed file. A report that simply says, the account is settled, your presence is no longer required in that part of the story. You're being asked to notice what moves into the space where the weight used to be. But there's something I haven't said yet. The name for what you were actually carrying. And for almost 2 decades, I was too afraid to say it out loud. It's a truth about who you are, and once you hear it, it's going to reframe things. Why they called you too much. Why the exhaustion never fully lifted. Why the severance was always going to bring them down. So here's what I need to say, and I need to say it carefully. Before I do, I want to speak to the part of you that's already tensing, the part that heard the phrase spiritual counterweight and quietly raised an eyebrow. The skeptic in you. The one who knows the difference between correlation and causation, who's read enough to recognize how easily we retrofit meaning onto suffering because meaninglessness is harder to bear. That skeptic isn't wrong to be here. I'm not asking you to silence it. I'm asking you to hold it in one hand and hold the actual timeline of your own life in the other. The sequence. The collapse patterns that followed every time you finally walked away. Don't interpret them yet. Just line them up. See whether the sequence repeats. Because if it does, the question stops being whether the pattern is real. The question becomes what the pattern is asking of you now that you've seen it. I was afraid that saying any of this out loud would put me in the same category as the people I spent my career learning to critique. The ones who see meaning in coincidence because they can't tolerate randomness. I studied those errors. I taught them, 23 students in a lecture hall at the University of Edinburgh, midway through a seminar on Indigenous knowledge frameworks, and I was methodical about drawing the line between superstition and technology, between wishful thinking and something that actually functions. But the conflict wasn't theoretical, it was a grinding daily cost. Every time I stood up there drawing that line, a quieter voice inside me was cataloguing evidence I wasn't allowed to present. Years of studying collapse patterns. Nights lying awake turning over data points that didn't fit the syllabus. A £40,000 research grant denied, politely, with a letter that called my life's work speculative anthropology. A marriage that slowly came apart because the person I was in daylight and the knowing I carried in private had grown too far apart for either of us to bridge. I filed my work in a drawer labeled interesting but unverifiable, and I paid for that with a piece of my life I'm not going to get back. So I didn't say it. For 18 years. Because saying it would have placed me on the wrong side of my own syllabus, but the evidence accumulated. Not in the abstract, in the tissue, in the sequence, in the timeline of what happened to the people who took from you, and what happened to you in the year after you finally stopped letting them. So here it is. What I was afraid to say. There is a category of people alive right now who function as counterweights. Their presence stabilizes something that would otherwise come undone. They don't announce this. They don't know how to explain it. Most of them, most of you, have never even had permission to acknowledge it consciously. You just live with what it leaves behind. The fatigue no blood test explains. The sense that you've been running a background process in every room you've ever walked into, one nobody asked for, nobody noticed, and nobody paid you for. And when you finally sever the connection, when you withdraw completely, whatever you were stabilizing begins its descent. Not slowly. The first stage is barely visible. The second gets dismissed. The third stage is what just reached you through a gap in a conversation you were never meant to hear. Now here's where it gets theologically difficult. Because most of us were raised, whether in religious households or rationalist ones or some complicated mix of both, we were raised to believe that love sustains, that pouring yourself into someone is supposed to help them grow, that your presence should make things better, not become a hidden dependency that breaks something when it finally leaves. And I want you to sit with that contradiction for a moment. Because it's real. You didn't cause the collapse, but your absence is what made it visible. You didn't punish anyone. The withdrawal of what you carried simply exposed the rot that was already there. You weren't the architect of their suffering. You were the scaffolding they had leaned against so long they forgot the wall wasn't holding itself up. Pause. That weight was never yours. That's not your guilt. That's not your responsibility. That's physics. And the same physics that freed you is going to make the next part of your life harder in ways you might not expect. Because the version of love you were handed, the one where you stay and keep pouring and keep being the quiet counterweight while they pull you into nothing, that was never love. That was an extraction wearing love's vocabulary. That weight was never yours. Not your guilt. Not your responsibility. That's just how physics works. And yet, the same physics that freed you is the physics that's going to make the next stretch harder, not easier. The version of love they sold you, the one where you stay and keep pouring and keep steadying the room while they drain you down to nothing, that was never love. That was something wearing love's language, something that took and called it connection. I spent years trying to build a legitimate case inside a legitimate institution, using every method they recognized. I wanted to show that certain lineages carried real, functional knowledge in their bodies and rituals, ways of moving through the parts of human experience that Western frameworks had no instruments fine enough to reach. The institution smiled. It nodded. It filed my work somewhere under * interesting but unverifiable * and moved on to the next grant cycle. But I was right, not because I'm special. Because the data is everywhere for anyone with a nervous system to perceive it and the honesty to say what it means. You have that nervous system. You've always had it, and that's the source of the long, quiet exhaustion you've been carrying. Here's what happens in the space where that 18-year counterweight used to live. You're going to feel something unfamiliar. It won't come as euphoria. It'll come as clearance, a sudden, cool openness deep in the chest. The slow recognition that something which had been pulling at you for years has finally gone slack. You'll notice it first as an absence. A tension you'd stopped registering because it had become the floor you stood on. Then you'll notice the spaciousness. In your home, in your own body, a quiet, almost matter-of-fact sense that the file is closed, that your signature is no longer required. And then, over the next day or two, you may start seeing the numbers. 444, 777. Not because you went looking, not on command, because the place you're standing now has always used these as confirmation for those who have completed something most people never complete in a single lifetime. What you were carrying for 18 years wasn't just someone else's weight. It was your own forging. A kind of perception that can't be taught in a classroom. It has to be earned the hard way through exactly what you went through. The forging is done now. But there's something I haven't said yet, something underneath everything else. The same sensitivity that let you sense the rot before it was visible. That's also why a specific kind of ordinary human experience has been, for a long time, quietly closed to you. One experience in particular. I want to read you something I wrote before you got here. Before this video existed. It was written in a room with one window, a desk that wasn't mine, and a silence that had been waiting a long time to be used. I sealed it. I didn't know when it would be opened. I only knew who it was for. You. You're not still carrying what you think you are. What's left now isn't the weight of what was done to you. It's the residue of having been the scaffolding for so long that your body forgot it was allowed to simply stand on its own. Without holding up someone else's structure. That cool opening you feel, that quiet clearance, that's not a reward. It's a restoration. Your nervous system coming back to what it was before someone first told you that your sensitivity was a problem rather than a sense. I'm not going to tell you to celebrate. I'm going to tell you something stranger than that. You're going to need a new language for what's coming, not the language of healing. That language was built for people still in the recovery ward. You're not there anymore. You're in the archive, filing the last document on a case that is now closed. The question isn't whether you'll be okay. The question is what you're going to build with the energy that's no longer being taken from you. Pause. That's what this letter was written to leave with you. Not what you lost, not who took it. What will you build? Subscribe so the next letter finds you. Pause. That's what this letter was written to leave with you. Not what you lost, not who took it.